Previously, we have defined globalization as according to Robertson, and now let us look at the bridge from classical sociological theory to theories of globalization. We'll recall how the theories of the classical sociologists paved or led the way towards theories of globalization, which are more contemporary. So we'll start off with Saint-Simon, Comte de Saint-Simon, who was the mentor towards Auguste Comte, and Auguste Comte was his protege. So Saint-Simon noticed that industrialization was inducing commonalities of practice across the disparate cultures of Europe. So basically, industrialization, which started off in Great Britain and followed by in France, were basically adopting similar measures of calculating the most effective and efficient ways of producing goods. And this in turn led to some similarities in the ways factories were built and the engineering methods used to calculate the most efficient ways of doing labor, and as well as calculating profit. So this kind of standardized the culture of production and manufacturing in Europe based on the needs of capitalism, which led towards similarity, which eventually leads towards an international system. Meanwhile, Durkheim theorized about differentiation and culture, where, if you recall, Durkheim talked about the existence of social institutions and also social facts, and also the two types of solidarity. And he theorized that as social institutions became more specialized, their commitment to the state weakens. And this implied that industrialization weakens collective communities and their commitments. So basically, if there was a nation state, and before industrialization, people's commitment towards the nation state was particularly strong, they have now turned their attention towards the process of industrialization and of accumulating profit. So they look at entire blocks of maybe countries or regions that traded as their source of income, rather than looking at individual nation states or individual patterns of culture. So this opened the way for dismantling boundaries between societies. So moving on, we come to Weber, who, if you recall, talked about rationalization as a result of the process of industrialization. And he identified rationalization as a solvent or catalyst for globalization. Because again, the process of rationalization results in similarities all across industrial countries. So Weber was also fundamentally concerned with the success of rationalization's iron cage, as he called it, the iron cage of bureaucracy, where everything is calculated and calculative. And rationalization also had its effects, where it implied that all cultures will become characterized by several attributes, which were the personalization of social relationships, refinement of calculation techniques, enhanced importance of specialized knowledge, and increased technical rational control over natural and social processes. This, of course, sounds very mechanical. So for Weber, he feared that this also implied a homogenization of cultures, as well as reduced commitment of patriotic values. And now we come to perhaps the most famous theorist, which is explicitly committed to a globalizing theory of modernization, none other than Karl Marx, who believed that globalization, although that wasn't the word they used back then, but this entire system of capitalism would cause an enormous increase in the power of the capitalist class because it opened up new markets for it. And Marx argued that this also had a cultural aspect, because the need for an ever-expanding market all over the globe gave a cosmopolitan or worldly character to production and also consumption. So when the large economies needed raw materials, they tended to go to certain parts of the world which produced or supplied these raw materials, and then they processed them in their industrial factories, and then they sold them back to other parts of the world at high prices to make profit. So now we come to the part of contemporary sociology, which is, as you recall, we have gone through the entire evolution of sociological theory. So this would fall under contemporary sociology, although it goes back several decades ago. So what we have here would be modernization theory, dependency theory, and also world systems theory. These are rather Marxian in terms of their conflict theory perspective. Dependency theory and world systems theory would be rather Marxian, while modernization is more structural functionalist. So as always, we start first with the structural functionalist perspective, which modernization theory has inherited. So we've talked about this previously, and just to recap, modernization theory is a model of economic and social development that explains global inequality in terms of differing levels of technological development among societies. It aims to explain, but not to criticize, and this perspective emerged in the 1950s, and it argues that poverty has been the norm for the entire world several centuries ago. It was only with the exploration of the world in the 1500s, by European powers, of course, that commercial potential emerged. So the main theorist, W. Rostow, outlined the process of modernization in 4 steps, which we covered in the previous lecture. The first being traditional stage, then takeoff stage, the third, drive to technological maturity, and finally, high mass consumption. So again, this is evolutionist and assumes that society moves in a straight or linear line from less advanced to more advanced. Now, just like Marx criticized the structural functionalists, we also have a conflict perspective here, which is called dependency theory. And this is, in contrast, it's a model of economic and social development that explains global inequality in terms of the historical exploitation of poor societies by rich ones. So they attempt to problematize the entire relationship between nation states. And dependency theorists argue that poor countries today are poor because of what rich countries have expropriated from them. Main theorists here, Gunther Frank, argued that the development of rich nations resulted from the colonial ties that caused underdevelopment in poor societies. And high-income countries have systematically impoverished low-income nations by making them dependent since centuries ago, similar to what Rostow explained with regards to the exploration of the world in the 1500s. But this is a very different perspective. And so they argue that poor nations are not simply lagging behind rich ones on a linear path of progress. So you also have another theorist, Wallerstein, who uses a model of the capitalist world economy to explain the origins of contemporary global inequality, where he imagines the world system as a kind of concentric circle where there's a core in the center, core nations, the most powerful ones, and then there's the semi-periphery around it, nations that are a bit more independent, and then you have the periphery, which are the poorest nations, totally dependent on the semi-periphery and also the core to harvest raw materials from them and to produce goods and to sell it back to them. And so now we come to Wallerstein's world systems theory, in which we feature the core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So this would be the main possible precursor to globalization theory, and they argue for an economic determinist approach. So of course, as mentioned, Wallerstein believed that the world is divided into core nations, semi-peripheral nations, and peripheral nations, in descending order of importance and power. However, 3 aspects of this theory are incompatible with the current globalization process. So this world systems approach has been critiqued for using a phenomenological rather than geographical approach. So this is more, the critics say that world systems theory have got a more conceptual idea of the relationship between nation states rather than to actually look at materialist factors like actual boundaries. So the examples the critics give are, like the first one being, in the Roman Empire, because it constituted a bounded set of societies in which individuals lived, and not because it tried to cover the whole planet. And number 2, nation-states play a key role in this model to stabilize the system. However, there is now debate as to whether the nation-state as a concept is still relevant. And the third one is that Wallerstein insisted that any world system can contain a multiplicity of separate cultures. However, in present times, current conditions appear to suggest a relativization of cultures or homogenization of cultures.